What if I told you that the economic systems the West is celebrating as revolutionary today were actually written in the heart of the Muslim world over 1,000 years ago? Long before Wall Street, long before modern banks and billion-dollar corporations, Muslims had already discovered a blueprint for building wealth, one that was ethical, balanced, and deeply spiritual. But here's the painful truth. While the world is now copying our forgotten wisdom, we've turned our backs on it. This video isn't just a history lesson. It's a wake-up call, because what you're about to hear will challenge everything you thought you knew about Islam, wealth, and power. Whether you're Muslim or not, this truth will leave you stunned. Watch closely, because this knowledge was never meant to stay buried. It was meant to lead. During the 8th to 13th centuries, the Islamic world experienced a period of extraordinary intellectual, economic, and cultural growth, often referred to as the Golden Age of Islam. This era was marked by the rise of great cities such as Baghdad, Cairo, Cordoba, and Damascus, centers not just of religious devotion, but of trade, science, scholarship, and wealth creation. At a time when much of Europe was in social and economic darkness, the Muslim world was lighting candles of knowledge and constructing systems of prosperity that would shape civilizations for centuries. Under the Abbasid Caliphate in particular, cities like Baghdad became epicenters of global trade. Muslim merchants were among the most trusted in the world, trading across Africa, Asia, and Europe, with networks that connected distant lands. These trade routes were not only for spices and silk, but also for knowledge, books, and ideas. The economic strength of these Muslim empires was built on solid foundations: justice in trade, honesty in transactions, and prohibition of exploitative practices like riba, interest. These principles created trust-based economies that allowed wealth to circulate with barakah, benefiting not just the elite, but communities at large. Institutions like the Beit al-Hikmah, House of Wisdom in Baghdad, became think tanks, where scholars translated Greek, Persian, and Indian texts into Arabic, expanded upon them, and created groundbreaking work in mathematics, astronomy, medicine, and economics. While Western Europe burned books, the Muslims preserved and built on them. The Islamic system of Waqf, charitable endowment, ensured that wealth was redistributed for the public good, supporting hospitals, schools, orphanages, and infrastructure. This allowed wealth not only to be created, but also to be sustained across generations. The architecture of marketplaces was designed not just for trade, but for fairness, standardized weights, anti-fraud enforcement, and moral guidelines rooted in the Quran and Sunnah. Economic growth during this period was never divorced from spiritual responsibility. Scholars like Imam Abu Hanifa were not just legal experts, but also wealthy merchants who practiced what they preached, integrating faith and finance. This synthesis of religion, economy, and ethics made the Muslim world an attractive model of prosperity, so much so that centuries later, European economists and philosophers would study and borrow from these systems without fully crediting their origins. Wealth in the early Muslim world was never viewed simply as the accumulation of gold, silver, or property. It was deeply rooted in the idea of barakah, divine blessing that multiplies benefit beyond calculation. Unlike the modern obsession with numbers and material gain, Muslims of the past prioritized intention, justice, and trust in their pursuit of wealth. This mindset came directly from the teachings of the Quran and the Prophet Muhammad, who emphasized that how wealth is earned matters more than how much is earned. A small halal income with sincerity and gratitude was seen as more valuable than mountains of haram wealth without accountability. The concept of niyyah, or intention, played a central role in Muslim economic ethics. Before engaging in trade or any financial activity, the Muslim businessman was expected to check his intention. Was he only to feed his family, to support the community, to avoid dependence on others? When the intention was sincere and rooted in service to Allah, wealth was not just lawful, but also spiritually rewarding. It became a form of worship. This inner foundation created an outward culture of transparency, generosity, and responsibility. Justice, or adla, was another pillar in Islamic economic life. Transactions were expected to be fair, contracts clearly written, and exploitation strictly forbidden. Price manipulation, hoarding, and deception were condemned in harsh terms. Economic justice wasn't a government policy, it was a religious duty. Business owners would willingly disclose defects in their products, honor returns, and share profit with workers in a way that upheld human dignity. This justice wasn't limited to Muslims. It extended to Jews, Christians, and others living under Muslim rule, many of whom preferred Islamic markets due to their fairness and ethical standards. Trust, or amana, was not just a word. It was a character trait that defined Muslim trade. A merchant's reputation was his real capital. People traveled miles just to do business with those known for their integrity. Contracts were sealed with a handshake and a prayer, and communities thrived because trust was the glue holding them together. Even international trade routes functioned without modern banking systems because of the widespread trust in Muslim merchants. Wealth flowed where trust lived, and in that trust lived the barakah that made Muslim civilizations shine. The early Muslim world developed economic systems that were both spiritually grounded and remarkably practical, giving rise to mechanisms like Waqf, expansive trade networks, and fully halal markets that functioned efficiently without the use of interest. The Waqf system was a charitable endowment where individuals would dedicate wealth or property for public benefit, such as funding schools, hospitals, mosques, or even roads and wells. Once established, these endowments were legally protected from being sold, inherited, or taxed, ensuring long-term sustainability of social welfare projects. This allowed wealth to be used for lasting impact across generations without government dependency, and helped build infrastructure that served rich and poor alike. Trade networks established by Muslims spanned across continents, connecting the Islamic world from West Africa to China. Muslim merchants sailed the Indian Ocean, crossed the deserts of North Africa, and moved along the Silk Road, carrying goods like spices, textiles, coffee, and metals. But beyond material trade, they also carried ethics, language, and faith. The strength of these networks wasn't just built on ships or caravans, but on the trustworthiness of Muslim businessmen and the fairness of their dealings. Contracts were often oral but honored strictly, and it was common for a Muslim merchant to leave goods with a local agent under trust, confident the terms would be respected, even across thousands of miles. Markets in the Islamic world operated under clear principles rooted in the Quran and Sunnah. The prohibition of riba ensured that wealth was not generated through exploitation or debt traps. Profit-sharing models like mudarabah and musharaka allowed people to invest and build wealth together based on mutual risk and reward. This promoted entrepreneurship and economic inclusion, even for those without capital. Market inspectors, known as mutasibs, were appointed to ensure ethical practices, fair pricing, honest weights and measures, and consumer protection. Briscoe says, also says cheating, price gouging, or creating artificial shortages were met with immediate correction, not as economic violations, but as moral and spiritual offenses. Because the economic system was built on shared values, it created stability and prosperity across vast regions. Cities like Cairo, Bukhara, and Cordoba became not only centers of trade, but models of integrity, where the flow of wealth reflected the balance between dunya and deen. The entire structure functioned without the modern banking system, proving that it was possible to build a flourishing economy on trust, ethics, and faith. Many of the financial systems and ethical frameworks that are celebrated in the modern Western world have roots in the principles and practices developed by early Muslims. Concepts like trust-based banking, ethical investing, and profit sharing are often presented today as forward-thinking or progressive, yet they closely mirror mechanisms that were widely practiced in the Islamic world over 1,000 years ago. Modern institutions have borrowed from these Islamic ideas, rebranded them with secular terminology, and implemented them through policy and regulation, often without acknowledging their original sources. Trust-based banking in the West, particularly in forms like cooperative banking and credit unions, operates on principles similar to those found in Islamic finance. These systems focus on mutual benefit, transparency, and community-centered lending, which aligns with Islamic financial contracts like Qard Hasan, benevolent loans, and Mudaraba, profit-sharing partnerships. Unlike interest-based lending, these arrangements distribute risk fairly between parties and encourage responsible financial behavior. These models were not invented in modern boardrooms, but can be traced back to the economic principles practiced in the marketplaces of early Islamic societies. Ethical investing, now a popular trend in Western finance, emphasizes social responsibility, environmental sustainability, and governance standards. Yet Muslims were guided by such filters centuries ago through the concept of halal and haram. Business ventures involving alcohol, gambling, deceit, or exploitation were prohibited not just for moral reasons, but as a financial ethic. Investments were evaluated not only for return, but for spiritual accountability. What is now marketed as impact investing was once simply the Islamic way of doing business. Profit and loss sharing models in the West, such as venture capital, mirror Islamic contracts like musharaka and mudaraba, where both the investor and entrepreneur share in the outcome, whether gain or loss. This stands in contrast to interest-based systems where the lender profits regardless of the borrower's success or failure. Such fairness and risk distribution was a cornerstone of Islamic financial ethics long before it became a regulatory aspiration in global capitalism. Western systems today are increasingly adopting these ideas, packaging them with modern tools and digital platforms, while Muslims often overlook or abandon the very principles that once made them leaders in economic thought. The irony is that what many Muslim societies now consider outdated or impractical is being embraced globally as innovative and sustainable. So the decline of Muslim economic power cannot be fully understood without recognizing how deeply it is tied to the loss of Islamic identity and principles. At one point in history, Muslims led the world in finance, trade, and ethical economic systems, guided by values rooted in the Quran and Sunnah. However, over time, as colonization, intellectual stagnation spread across the Muslim world, those foundational values were gradually abandoned. Wealth began to be pursued not as a tool for justice and service, but as a symbol of power and personal gain. The shift from barakah-centered thinking to purely profit-driven motives marked a spiritual and practical turning point. When Muslims distanced themselves from the original economic teachings of Islam, such as the prohibition of riba, the importance of honest trade, and the centrality of trust and accountability, the entire system began to deteriorate. Markets became corrupt. Contracts were no longer honored with the same integrity, and the ethical standards that once made Muslim traders respected across continents began to fade. In many places, Islamic finance was either replaced or deeply compromised by Western capitalist models, sometimes imposed through colonial institutions and sometimes adopted willingly by elites seeking wealth without accountability. At the same time, Western thinkers, economists, and institutions began studying Islamic history and quietly absorbing the economic mechanisms that had once made the Muslim world flourish. Ideas like profit sharing, community investment, and fair trade were analyzed, refined, and integrated into Western systems, often without recognition of their origins. While Muslims were moving away from their own traditions, the West was learning from them, repackaging the principles under secular frameworks, and implementing them with greater discipline and long-term planning. The painful truth is that Muslims began imitating Western financial systems that were themselves shaped by Islamic values, though stripped of their spiritual foundations. In trying to chase modernity, many Muslim societies forgot that the tools of prosperity had already been given to them, not just through history, but through divine guidance. This disconnection from their own economic heritage has left many Muslims dependent on imported models that neither reflect their values nor deliver long-term stability. As a result, they are caught between a forgotten past and an uncertain future, often looking outward for solutions that were once embedded in their own faith and civilization. The painful truth that many Muslims must confront today is that the very financial systems they admire in the West are built on principles once central to Islamic civilization, yet now largely forgotten or ignored by the Muslim world itself. While Muslim ancestors built flourishing economies on values such as honesty, justice, trust, and the prohibition of interest, these values have been sidelined in favor of Western economic models that emphasize speed, competition, and accumulation without spiritual accountability. The irony lies in the fact that many of the economic tools being promoted today as innovative or progressive, ethical banking, risk sharing, socially responsible investing, are essentially rebranded versions of Islamic finance concepts that have existed for centuries. Muslims now find themselves admiring systems that were shaped in part by the very values their own faith introduced to the world. What was once theirs is now seen as foreign, while the actual Islamic models are viewed by some as outdated, impractical, or overly restrictive. This mental and spiritual detachment has created a generation that is often unaware of the depth and sophistication of their own financial legacy. As a result, Muslims are trying to fix economic problems using frameworks that were never designed to serve their spiritual or communal needs. They chase interest-based loans, speculative investments, and debt-drawn lifestyles, while the teachings of the Quran clearly warn against such paths. In universities, students study Western economic theories without ever learning how Muslim scholars like Ibn Khaldun, Al-Ghazali, and Abu Yusuf laid the foundations for ethical economic thought centuries earlier. In business, many look up to modern entrepreneurs while knowing little about the merchant life of the Prophet Muhammad and how he modeled integrity and fairness in trade. This lack of historical and spiritual awareness causes a deep identity crisis. Muslims are not just disconnected from their heritage, they are often being led by systems built on diluted versions of their own principles. This painful truth is not just about the past being forgotten, but about the future being misdirected. When a civilization loses its sense of ownership over its own knowledge, it becomes a follower rather than a leader. Until Muslims reconnect with the essence of their economic teachings, not just in theory, but in practice, they will continue to chase what they once inspired, remaining consumers of ideas they originally introduced to the world. So here we are, standing at a crossroads between forgotten legacy and borrowed systems, between divine wisdom 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 and borrowed systems, between divine. For over 1,000 years, Muslims led the world not just with swords or sermons, but with ethics, trade, knowledge, and wealth that carried barakah. The world admired us, copied us, and rose while we slept. And now, while we chase systems that were inspired by our own deen, we failed to realize the blueprint was never lost. We just stopped following it. If the West can thrive using pieces of our forgotten principles, imagine what we can do if we return to them fully with sincerity, intelligence, and courage. The painful truth is not meant to shame us, it's meant to wake us. The Ummah doesn't need to invent something new, it needs to return to what was always true. The time to reclaim that legacy is now. May Allah guide you to success in both this world and the next. May your efforts to learn, grow, and uplift the Ummah be filled with wisdom, sincerity, and barakah. Thank you for listening. And remember, you were never meant to follow. You were created to lead. Good luck and peace be upon you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah. Good luck and peace be upon you. Wassalamu alaikum wa rahmatullah.